It really is exceptionally hard to make a perfect open world game. If you create a world that's interesting to navigate in, that has tons to do, oftentimes the story or the characters don't really mesh well or aren't very strong. If you create an open world that has incredible characters that are varied and interesting and maybe even relate to certain areas in the game, chances are it's very hard to find a directive plot that pushes you along in an interesting way. And as always, I think this is perhaps the most common one in an open world game. You have an interesting plot that does very little to take advantage of the other two. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, though, is one of those rare experiences that melds together those elements, an incredibly vast and interesting open world, characters that relate to that open world and are lovable and hateable and change, and a plot that urges you forward and connects all three of those elements. The one unfortunate thing, though, with this experience that I really think was almost perfect, it was by far my favorite Assassin's Creed experience, this game bears very little resemblance to the games that preceded it. And that was an issue that a lot of people had with the past few iterations of Assassin's Creed, of how it's changed into something that's very different. This is not a tactical assassin game. It's an incredibly interesting, fun, and varied open world experience. And if you can just for a moment try to look at this game on those merits, I think it's one of the best open world experiences you can have. Valhalla is Ubisoft's take now on Norse mythology and Viking lineage. It's very similar to what God of War did a couple years ago. It's also a direct sequel in many ways to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, especially the modern telling. Layla is back again, and the events of the previous game in the modern version have a lot to do with what's happening in this one. As for the historical telling, we're playing as Eivor, a Viking man or woman who was operating in Norway in the late 800s when their family was slaughtered, and they decided, as many of these characters do, to find revenge. At that point, they then decided to head to England at the time. Historically, this time period, it's ripe with stories of Anglo-Saxons and Danes fighting and trying to make a new country. When you do get to England is when this story really amps up in ways I didn't expect. Before that, a lot in the game felt very similar to other Assassin's Creed stories that we've played before. Beautiful locales, a level of customization and side missions and side activities that's absolutely unheard of. Every sort of item that you find, every piece of armor can be adapted and changed and upgraded in some way. You can play dice, you can do rap battles, drinking games, interesting stuff that doesn't necessarily connect at all with the world in the first several hours. When you get to England, though, and your motivations change from just trying to find revenge into now establishing a foothold in this new country, that basis point, I think, is one of the best for an open world game. Because at that point, any of your interactions with the different tribes and areas in England is now all towards that prime directive of trying to build up your settlements, essentially make a legacy there. From a narrative standpoint, each petty kingdom that you interact with on the map usually has one core story arc that ties into a family and a set of characters there. The really interesting thing is all of that ties into helping the settlement, but all of the side content in those areas also help that one idea. So many of these games can feel overwhelming. Having this one prime directive of trying to improve the settlements allows sometimes mundane tasks that you would normally find in an open world game seem to have some additional value. And where Valhalla really finds its genius is how each of those secondary stories that are built in an open world that have a lot of fun stuff to do around it, that tie into your prime directive of what you're trying to do, also tend to teach Eivor and us, the player, some type of lesson about character, about what this world means. It's just grade A, top tier storytelling that's fun and interesting to do. One of the best additions to that, of course, is when that does get a little bit tired and a little bit heavy. The side content and side stories, very similar to what we've seen in Red Dead Redemption, can add a little bit of humor and a change of pace in a way that I thought might have gotten wary, but they're all fleshed out. There's cutscenes for all of them. There's just such high quality in every little piece of action in this game that things that would normally seem tired in other games seem interesting and exciting. You know, finding the 20 different sets of collectibles of maybe 100 or more than that. Some of them, I think there might be thousands when it comes to the finding individual things of wealth, actually have a connection to the story and motivate you to complete them in really interesting and kind of clever ways. More than that, too, they tell you exactly what you've gotten from where, and that's just kind of a pet peeve of mine. Too many open world games don't do that, so it's really great to have that level of interactivity. It may seem like a lot, and it is. This is by far the longest Assassin's Creed game that I think they've ever produced. It reminds me more, again, of a Red Dead Redemption, but some of the problems I had in that game are answered by having a structure that works, having so many incredibly fun things to do, and adding in the addition of the Norse gods. This game really relies on that heavily, with you very early on in the game, so it's not a spoiler, actually able to go to Asgard in some capacity and experience the realm of the gods in a fun and interesting way. They just do so many things right. The unfortunate side is when things do go wrong, they feel very wrong. So I think this game would be so much better if it was not hampered by the legacy of Assassin's Creed. The modern story elements, the story behind the story of why we're doing this, anytime that comes into play, I think it just undercuts this great, interesting world and great, interesting characters that have been developed. I get that it's not always in your face, and now you actually have the option to go back to the modern world whenever you want to. You can kind of get out of the animus. But anytime they try to link this complicated story together, I think it's too muddled, and unfortunately, as you near the end of this, I think nearly 100-hour experience, they rely even more heavily on the modern story and everything behind it. And I really was disappointed when we got to that line, but ultimately, this is a game that will give you something that Assassin's Creed always attempted to, but I don't think ever really achieved before this. It's a perfect confluence of those elements that are in all these games that we all really love. You know, why do we love open world games? Because there's so much you can do. There's interesting characters, and hopefully there's an interesting story. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is the best connection of all three of those things, but is not perfect because of the elements that have brought it here. It's kind of ironic that the reason we're playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla is the legacy of Assassin's Creed, but at this point, and how it's implemented at least, seems to be holding the series back. It is an absolute must play, especially if perhaps, and I think many of you may have, played some of God of War, the previous iteration, and are just itching for more of that storytelling. It continues here in a big way, and I'm eager to see what Ubisoft can do next with Assassin's Creed.